Well, thank you all for inviting me. You may wonder how somebody who digs in Mexico and Central America and researches those things, how did I ever get into talking about something that's local up here? In 1970, it's coming to be almost half a century, my wife and I bought a lovely farm in Heath. And it wasn't long before I found out that there's a historical site up in Heath called Fort Shirley. And I started to research this kind of. And this was left to the Heath Historical Society by the ladies who actually founded the Historical Society back, I don't know, what, about 1900 or something. And so I was curious. I'd never really done a historical dig. And it's different than digging prehistoric sites or sites where you can't read what the people wrote. So
flick your microphone on, it's not
oh,
on.
that would help.
Yeah.
So this is how I got into this. And I got fascinated with historical archaeology because of that, and started to teach it at Yale and in my courses. And in the summer of 1974, I got permission from the society and decided to have a summer dig up at Fort Shirley. What will we find at this place? There's almost nothing to see on the surface left of it, except a memorial stone that was put up again about 1900. So I got some volunteer students from Yale and volunteer students locally, and we dug it. And then about halfway through the dig, and it was raining almost every day, which was no fun, I discovered that 5.5 miles to the west in the town of Rowe is Fort Pelham, another historical site. And there had been a UMass crew working there for 2 years. So I clued right into these people, and they turned over all the things that they had found at Fort Pelham there to me for study. And I put all these things together. Then I, of course, discovered very fast that there's a whole line of forts like this that belonged to the mid-18th century, pre-revolutionary, in a war that most people never even heard of. We call the French and Indian War. So let's move to the first one, please, Jan. This war was the First World War. The first time a war had covered most of the planet, at least in its extent. In northeastern North America, in South America, in the Antilles, in the Caribbean, in Europe, where it becomes known as the 7 Years' War, West Africa, in India, and as far east as the Philippines. And there was a war between, as you can see here, Great Britain and France. Now this has old roots. Next, please. The English occupation of North America up till the time of the French and Indian War, you can see two episodes. This is very early on in the 17th century, when the English or British colonization lay well to the east of the Appalachians. It's basically a coastal sort of bunch of colonies like Chile is today, all strung out along there. But it turns out that the British, the English and Scottish and Welsh and whatnot, had an enormously high birth rate, and plus people coming in from Great Britain. By 1755, right in the middle of the French and Indian War, the British controlled their colonies, now all of the East Coast, east of the Appalachians, and were in conflict with the French, who never had as many people. You can see how they had penetrated to the Great Lakes region, but it was a really not a colonization like this. This was an inundation of people with a very high birth rate and very successful. It's a very good life. A lot of these people, of course, were indentured servants who came over, and some of them were actually criminals who've been deported from England for their country's sake, and like what happened later in Australia, particularly in the South. So that was a situation. From the beginning, the French and the English were like oil and water. They did not get along with each other. The French were largely French Catholics. The English were various denominations, but except for Maryland, non-Catholic. So there was a religious background to the wars that started between them. So what about the Indians, the native populations? The European invasion of the New World resulted in, within the space of 100 to 200 years, of only 10% of the native populations of the Western Hemisphere left, largely because of disease, but also because of misuse and a really hard way of life. But the English really came into violent contact with the native Indians of New England, and it was no question about it, a war of genocide, helped by introducing European diseases against which they had absolutely no way of fighting back. So, but there were some wars, as you know, all during the 17th century into the early 18th century. And eventually these Indian groups, all Algonquin speakers of Algonquin languages, were forced to move up, many of them, up into Canada, where they came under French control and French protection. And for a very long period of time, raids were carried out on the frontier settlements of New England, of Massachusetts in particular. And Deerfield, of course, was the big point of contact. Next, please. This area, as you know, we're on the fringes of it, is a tremendous upland area to the west of the Connecticut River. And you'd think that this would mean that raids sponsored by the French or Indian raids would have a hard time, getting down into the English settlements. This area, actually, this is looking north of Route 2, the Mohawk Trail, and it's a tremendously difficult area to move through, actually. But there's, on the side of the French and Indians, next please, the river systems pretty much run north and south. And these became natural routes for raiders and large parties to come in and attack places like Northfield, where we are, which happened many times. Deerfield in particular. And while there was no war declared, this was a conflict that has old roots here. And the Deerfield was just a natural way for them, these hostile groups with French officers, to come down and raid the frontier settlements like Northfield, Deerfield, etc. Coleraine. Next, please. Now, back when these things were getting hotter and hotter in the by the sort of mid-18th century, around, let's say, 1744 is what we're dealing with here. the colonial governor of Massachusetts was William Shirley. And William Shirley was an English lawyer, actually, who had come here, settled in Boston and Roxbury, had built a beautiful house there. And he was in charge of us in those days. And he was, without any question, I've read biographies of him and everything, by far the best of all the British governors in North America. Highly popular and a very just and decent person. He was, William Shirley was taking orders, of course, from London. King George II, who probably never spoke English without a German accent, he was a Hanover. The prime minister at this point was Henry Pelham, and then a few others, while Shirley was governor. And Shirley had amazing contacts in this part of Massachusetts. Next, please. This is what we call the river gods who ruled out here. And here they are and where they lived. And you can see here, the river gods included Joseph Dwight here in, where are we now? Brookfield. Springfield William Pynchon. But it's up in this area, you can see that there's one really important family, and that's the Williams family. The Williams family really controlled everything out here. In Israel Williams here was a senior member of the family, and in the story that I'm going to tell, he was extremely important. Later on became, of course, famous as a Tory who refused to acknowledge the American Revolution and stood his ground too, by God. So you had here in Hatfield, you had Israel Williams and other river gods here. Up in Deerfield, you had the Williams family. Elijah Williams was the storekeeper, was a judge, was a military procurement officer, and just about everything. In Deerfield, if you had any problems, you'd end up in the hands of the Williamses. And married into this Williams family was the Reverend Jonathan Ashley, who was a fiery preacher against the French and Indians, and right from the beginning. In Fort Massachusetts, which later became the headquarters of the line of forts in what's now North Adams, Ephraim Williams, who I'll talk about later, was really commander there. And William Williams, was, a cousin, was the founder of Pittsfield, what used to be called Pontusic, but later named for William Pitt. Ephraim Williams Sr. hung out here in Stockbridge. And these people were extremely wealthy, extremely talented, and very good at military matters. Next, please. Now, Deerfield is where really a lot of them lived and controlled. And the interesting thing about Deerfield is we've got the idea that, you know, it's only down south of the Mason-Dixon line that black slavery was in operation. Not at all. Places like Providence, Rhode Island, the Colonial of Massachusetts had plenty, New Hampshire had plenty of slavery if you could afford it. And I've just put in red down the street in Deerfield, all the families that owned slaves. I point this out really to show their wealth. They could not have had slavery like this unless they were extremely wealthy. And Elijah Williams, the storekeeper, he had a few. So everybody who could afford it had 1, 2, or maybe 3 or 4 slaves. and they traded them back and forth. Next, please. This, for instance, is a document signed by Ephraim Williams, Jr., as I say, later on, the hero of the Battle of Crown Point. You'll hear about him at Williams College in a moment. Here he is selling to his uncle Israel Williams, one of his young slaves. I think he's only 9 years old. It's a bill of sale telling him that you can do what you want with this guy because he's not a free person. And you can see these things down at the PVMA library, Pawcatuck Valley Memorial Association, which has wonderful documents on all of this. Next, please. So Shirley, really, he saw the danger of what is going to happen, that things are really heating up now between England and France, between Great Britain and France. And he decided to organize a real defense of the New England, of Massachusetts west of the Connecticut River. And he decided this in 1744 in concert with Israel Williams and other members of the Williams family. What Shirley was, he was transmitting powers that came to him from Parliament in London and from his political protectors, the prime ministers, to passing these things on to his river gods out there. And they were going to organize a real defense, basically relying upon the militia in what's now Franklin County. So he decreed that there's going to be a line of forts. Shirley had probably never been through here. He decided there's going to be a line of forts extending from Northfield here all the way across to the edges of New York, the colony of New York, and the Dutch settlements here. It's very similar to the idea of the dew line. I don't know if you remember that in the Cold War, which supposedly is now over, in concert with Canadians and Icelanders and so on, there were a string of radar stations all across the northernmost part of Canada, extending from Alaska all the way to Iceland. And they were very worried about a Soviet attack which would cross over the North Pole, from Siberia and blast the United States and Canada off the map. This was, but that was an early warning site, and this was an early warning thing here. So the idea was that intervals, according to Shirley, intervals of about 5.5 miles going west, there'd be one fort after another. And the Northfield houses there were fortified houses here that were called forts, where you put a palisade around a house and fortified the house itself. But the actually built forts specifically, the first one was in Heath, right here, which was named, curiously enough, Fort Shirley, for Governor Shirley. And so then the next thing is they're going to have another one 5.5 miles to the west. So that is what is now Rowe. It wasn't Rowe then, but it was really owned by Charlemont up here. But so they established this for Fort Pelham, named for Henry Pelham, one of the politicians in the government of George II, who was a protector of Shirley. But then what? It was decided to be another fort 5.5 miles to the west of that. Well, Governor Shirley hadn't reckoned on the uplands here that are west of the Connecticut River, west of the Deerfield, and it was really a hard job, but they finally established Fort Massachusetts in North Adams. And then the last one in the line of force was, you can see here, West Hoosick, named for the Hoosick River, which flows through there, which is now in Williamstown. That was William Williams. But we'll talk about Fort Shirley. Next, please. So now about Fort Shirley. This was the first one. And what I had not realized when I started digging Fort Shirley was the extent of the documents on this site. This is one of the great things about historical archaeology. You're not guessing about who these people were. You know who these people were really all the way back to when they were born, what they were doing, everything about them. And these documents are an enormous quantities. Elijah Williams, a storekeeper in Deerfield, kept absolutely great records of who he sold everything to and when. And these are his famous account books, which are in the PVMA. I think there might be one in Northampton. There's Massachusetts Historical Society. The Mass Historical Society turned out to have all the records of who they were actually assigned to different forts at different times, how much they were paid, when they were mustered out. So we really have amazing documents on these people. Next, please. Including the building of Fort Shirley that was ordered by Colonel Israel Williams, passing on the orders of Governor Shirley in 1744. It tells you exactly how this thing was built. You know, how much wood would go in, how many nails. These were wooden forts. So this wasn't a question of having to dig up a lot of stone. And I told you in Old Tenor, that's one particular time during the monetary policies there. So many 6 shillings a day for other people coming in here. You can see it's all here. And William Williams, the founder of Pittsfield, was the one who was in charge of actually building this fort. Next, please. So, we started in sorry, I'm back in the mid-18th century. In 1974, digging, and you could see what we hit were the collapsed chimneys, stone chimneys of these. There were double fireplaces and one chimney, a front to back fireplace that is facing each other out. So you had 2 rooms for each chimney. And all kinds of military artifacts started to show up, such as bullets, lead for casting. There was no question that this was a military site here. Next, please. It rained every day, as I said, and the hard pan is not far below the soil surface. So, I mean, it was like doing an underwater site. Finally, after about a month and a half of this, I said, we've done enough here. This is the layout. That's a fallen chimney there. There was another one section. No, it was another one right here with 2 fireplaces. All the stones had been on the surface that were visible after it was abandoned in 1754 were taken off in the 19th century by farmers who owned this site, and to build stone walls to keep the sheep in those days. So there was nothing to be seen on the surface at all. You just had to dig for it. But we finally figured the thing out. What did this actually look like? Next, please. That's a reconstruction of what Fort Shirley looked like on the basis of our excavations, on the basis of that order that came from Israel Williams, how to build it, etc. They had the so-called parade here was covered over with timbers. Some of the timbers from Fort Shirley still exist in our historical society, and there's one or two old houses in Heath that have preserved timbers from the walls around it. And there are the two barracks where they lived, and two strong points here that had, at least one of them had a swivel gun there, which Fort Shirley was never attacked, so they didn't have to, nobody ever tried it out. But it was after 1754, after it had been there 10 years, it became quite clear it was not strategically important, except to attract people. So they kept a very small number of people in one family occupied this until the end of the whole 7 Years' War, French and Indian War. But can you imagine what this was like in midwinter in, let's say, 1750? These people hold up, they had window glass, they smoked tons of tobacco. We know all of this from sales in Elijah Williams' store, and you'll see the pipes that they smoked at, and tons of booze. This place floated on booze, this line of forts. And can you imagine the stench in these places? These people, when the snow's out here about 2 or 3 feet high, they're supposed to go out on snowshoes, and the rest of the time they're sitting in these rooms. It must have not been easy. Next, please. Towards the end of our dig, we saw a slight depression in the ground, and I thought, oh boy, this is going to be an outhouse. Now, the two great things to hit in a historical site like this are outhouses and wells. And believe it or not, they're often right next to each other, because when you get down in these things, they're anaerobic, believe it or not, and they preserve all kinds of organic materials, wood and stuff like that you might not expect. They're wonderful. I mean, they're treasure troves, and historical archaeologists aim right for them. There was a great one that the Smithsonian dug in Deerfield, a 3-holer that belonged to Dr. Thomas Williams, Ephraim Williams' brother, who was the surgeon, the medical man for the line of forts, the people in the line of forts. And that turned out to have all kinds of stuff in it. So, but this turned out to be a wooden well. I never heard of wooden wells, but they did exist in these forts, and we dug this thing right on down. I'd hoped to find all kinds of stuff, but it was amazing opening that thing because nobody had seen this well since 1763, when people stopped living there completely. It's like perfectly preserved because it's waterlogged and anaerobic. The little microbes couldn't get at the wood. We did find stuff at the bottom. Next. That's what we did find, pegs, and this looks like a gaming piece of some sort. They must have been incredibly bored in this place. And so you'd say, well, they must have looked forward to, Christmas, Thanksgiving, blah, 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 blah. None of that. In this part of the colonial Massachusetts world, every day was like every other day except for the Sabbath, which everybody had to follow. There was no Christmas. Never was to the Puritan Congregationalists who these people were. And But if a wedding took place, then that was something else. But that was the only time that they ever relaxed. Next, please. Now, in so it was built in 1744. In 1745, the next year, Governor Shirley dreamed up the most audacious plan that anybody could conceive of. When people were captured on one side or the other, between the French and the English, they'd be taken captive. If they were English, they'd be French, they'd be taken to Boston. If they were English, they'd be taken up to Montreal or Quebec. And then they would be ransomed. It was a money-making operation. And some returned English captives coming back to Boston, Shirley interrogated them about the fortress of Louisbourg, the greatest fort north of Mexico, in North America, up on Cape Breton Island, you know, the maritime provinces, and impregnable, huge thing. And Shirley heard that it wasn't all that great. I mean, that the people living in it were discontented. It was cold and wet and miserable up there at the mouth of the St. Lawrence. And he decided it could be taken. So he got together all of his militia people from the forts, and they went up there. And the British, some of them went up by boat up there, and then landed, the British Navy. And they dragged their artillery with them over an impossible swamp and then up into to an upland that overlooked the fortress of Louisbourg. And all the few guns that were around, they spiked so the French couldn't use them again. And it's exactly what happened to the British when the Japanese invaded Singapore. The guns were pointed in the wrong direction, out to sea instead of inland. And they took the place. It was an immense victory. And all the bells rang and all across Massachusetts, Boston, and they named a square Louisbourg Square in Boston. However, perfidious Albion traded it back in 1748 to the French in return for for what's called Chennai today in India. Very important port. This is one of the things that led, I think, up to the revolution. These people were really PO'd here for having that happen. At any rate, in 1745, also, one day, Thomas Williams came to Fort Shirley to see who's sick, or there were plenty of people sick, you can believe it, from E. coli, from the contamination of these wells. And so he took off to Fort Pelham in Massachusetts. And Massachusetts was founded by that time, and the fortress. He left his little girl behind and his wife and another kid. I'm sorry, not Thomas Williams, but the Reverend Norton, who was a Yale graduate, who was chaplain to the line of forts. And they took off to Fort Massachusetts. However, what happened was that Fort Massachusetts had a major attack on it. And hundreds of French soldiers and officers came down, and their Indian allies from who had taken refuge up in Canada near Montreal, and laid siege to the place. And Ephraim Williams should have been there because by that time he was commander of Fort Massachusetts. but he's probably was back home in Deerfield, I don't know. John Hawkes, who was the hero, the great hero of the entire French and Indian War up here. John Hawkes, fantastic marksman. He was a sergeant, and he was lieutenant, I guess, by that time, and not a member of the big shots at all of the moneyed interest. He was commander up there. Half the people in the fort, Massachusetts, were sick of bloody diarrhea, which is no, so I said, given their ideas of sanitation, I'm not at all, I don't wonder at this. So what happened was that after 2 days, their lead ran out to make shot. Meanwhile, John Hawkes had killed the Indian chief who came down with them, and somebody else had winged the French commander in his arm. But they stayed, and they had a terrible night. These people, the enemy was trying to burn the place down. And here they were, men, women, and children inside miserably. Finally, at the second day, their lead gave out, and they had to capitulate. So Hawkes and the Reverend Norton and all the others who had not been killed by that time were taken all the way up to Canada and had to be ransomed. And they were ransomed after a year. When the Reverend Norton came back to Fort Shirley to his family, he saw that his little girl had died. And her grave is outside where the fort was, dug by the soldiers there. And this little gravestone, that's a headstone, was put up. Next, please. There it is. It's in the Heath Historical Society. It's still out there. Here lies the body of Anna Norton, daughter of the Reverend Mr. John Norton. She died in the 7th year of her age. Later on, one of the professors at Williams College, who was a very good historian, dragged it off to Williams. And the Heath Historical Society demanded it back and got it back. So they had a rededication of Anna Norton's grave. Next, please. Now, Fort Pelham was put together about the same time as Fort Shirley. And Fort Pelham, the remains of it are in Rowe. If you go to Rowe, drive by the lake, and before you get into Rowe's Center, if you turn right north up there and walk up on the top of the hill, that's where Fort Pelham is. It's very well marked. Fort Shirley, by the way, is also well marked now by the Historical Society. Next, please. When you look at it, Fort Pelham, that's all you see, basically. It's just flat ground with some stone walls around. Here's one of them right here. In actuality, this is a map made by the UMass people of Fort Pelham. Fort Pelham was actually inside a stockade, which ran around here. There's a ditch, stockade ditch, all along here. And again, all the farmers who began to move in after after 1763, used those rocks, took the chimneys apart, and made stone walls out of them. But this is the area that they dug. And it was a long-term dig. It went on for 2 years. So there's a lot of material. Next, please. Next. This is the distribution of every single piece of animal bone. There's a well a circular well. Nobody's ever been in there. I thought of doing it, but it's extremely dangerous. It's made of rock, And I almost went into it, but not a good idea. But all of this stuff was garbage from what they ate that they just threw out the window. And good old backcountry New England style, you sort of airmail it out, all out the window, out the doors. You could tell where the windows were and the doors just by tracking the garbage. And of course, this garbage, we can tell what they were eating and when, at least as far as the animals were. They had sheep, and they had pigs, and they had cattle. In a way, it was a farm. Next, please. This is early on. This was some of the first computers ever to come out, and you can see here, there's where all the nails exist. These are hand-wrought nails before they started making machine-cut nails, and there's thousands of them. This is the distribution of them. This is the distribution of all the garbagey animal bones. You can sort of work out exactly where this was. Next, please. And then, thirdly, Fort Massachusetts. Fort Massachusetts is in North Adams. And this surely was the first headquarters with F.A. Williams. Then it became Fort Massachusetts, a much bigger and more important affair because it really was right in the line of fire. Next, please. So where is it now? the good citizens of North Adams, Mass. Simply let it be paved over by Price Chopper, and it's under the parking lot, most of it there. And very little is known archaeologically about it because of this, which is really a shame because it was enormously important. But that's the way things go. Next, please. There's a rebuilt chimney on part of the site, and this was put up in, I guess, 1920 something, to mark where Fort Massachusetts had been. But it's really sad. Next, please. So now we'll look at the artifacts here. Next, please. So what are military artifacts? This is, I've combined in this both Fort Shirley and Fort Pelham because they're really so close to each other, and they were occupied at exactly the same time by the same people, often interchangeably. Those are gun flints. These are French gun flints, beautiful honey-colored gun flints. These are much poorer, locally made or British gun flints. These are the different. These are for rifles and for plain old muskets, and then you have different levels of buckshot. When at night, that night that they passed at Fort Massachusetts, when they were surrounded by French and Indians, they couldn't see their targets, so they fired buckshot at them. And the great complaints from both the Indians and the French about how dastardly that was. Next, please. This is some of the ironwork from these two sites. These are a couple of pieces of horseshoes. These two, this one, that's a horseshoe, that's a horseshoe, that's a horseshoe. That's not a horseshoe. That's part of an ox shoe. So the old timers around this part of the world would know what that was when oxen were still a couple of huge hand-wrought nails. These are horse trappings, buckles and things. Next, please. And loads of these pipe parts here. Clay, what we would call clay churchwarden python, long stems. Now, right away, every single piece of a pipe was not made in North America, was made back in England. And in this case, all by the firm of Robert Tippett. And they're a marker for the mid-18th century. There are actually ways of dating these things that I won't go into here because I haven't got time looking at the bores of these pipes. But these are all over the place there. And as I can imagine, just the general sort of fog going on there, that, oh, can you imagine the stench of this? And can you imagine the state of their lungs? Next, please. Lots of glass. Not only window glass, but bottle glass. Beautiful crystal wine glasses. Again, not made in North America at all, but imported from England. Wine bottles. That doesn't mean they were drinking wine. This is all the rum that was sold by Elijah Williams back in Deerfield got put into bottles like this. Simply reused wine bottles. They got nothing made locally. Next, please. Beautiful pottery. That's a white salt glazed ware, very fine, made in the Midlands in England by the potteries in the mid-18th century. That was actually a teacup because handles and saucers hadn't been invented at that time. They came in later in the 18th century, so they drank their tea out of it. A beautiful snuff box cover made out of brass, gilded, and a wonderful cufflinks pair with little mermaids on it. Totally 100% English. Next, please. Forks, which had bone handles, which are disintegrated. Two-tined forks. Three-tined forks come in by Revolutionary War times later on in the 18th century. These are all knives, table knives. These are what we call jackknives, clasp knives. All of these things show up in Elijah Williams's book, sold out of Deerfield and gotten by Elijah from his suppliers in Boston, who got their stuff from suppliers in England. Next, please. Lead spoons. The amount of lead contamination here must have been just horrific. These things, the molds for those were undoubtedly brought from England and cast locally. Next, please. That shows you from various sites of the same period in colonial North America. Michilimackinac out by Lake Michigan, Pelham right here, and Ligonier down in Pennsylvania. This shows you that Pelham relied heavily upon pigs. Some of that was salt pork, but a lot of it was real pigs because they have the bones there. Cows and some sheep. It was in a way self-supporting. Next, please. Now, some of this glass is extremely good. That's window glass. I've forgotten whether that's Shirley or Pelham. And then look at these beautiful bottles here, eggshell thin. Those are pharmaceutical bottles that were brought by Thomas Williams all the way from Deerfield by horse or muleback up to Shirley and Pelham. And, that was no easy haul, I can tell you. It's really quite amazing. Thomas Williams, we know a lot about him. There's actually some Thomas Williams descendants who have some things from Thomas Williams. If you want to see what Thomas Williams wore when he was in the regular army, British Army. There's you go to the Williams College Library, and they've got his beautiful flaming red jacket there and other things. So we know a lot about him. We've got all of his books too. Every time he gave what he called a phlebotomy, in other words, bled somebody, it's listed in there. And since because he bought a lot of his stuff from his cousin Elijah at the store, Elijah has documented what he sold to Thomas Williams. And Thomas Williams had a drinking problem. He was one of the biggest topers there. And you can see in his account books of what he prescribed and whatnot, his hand starts getting to shake, goes all to pieces about once a month. This is after he has had big amounts of rum bought from his cousin, Elijah. And you can see out in the stuff that the Smithsonian got in his privies, you can see also what he did with a lot of the bottles when he finished drinking. He used to drink out there in the privy so his wife wouldn't see what was going on. Next, please. And money. This is all British money from George I and George II. There, with the exception of this, which is a French 10 sou piece. There was a lot of illicit trade going on with the French up in Canada, out of Boston. John Hancock, for instance, was under investigation by the British government for being a smuggler. And if the revolution had not taken place, he would have been locked up. But you've seen his signature on the Declaration of Independence. He got away with it. Next, please. So that was the line of forts. And as I say, except for Massachusetts, these were basically scouting sites to go out in the summertime on Indian moccasins to pick up tracks of people heading south, or in the wintertime on snowshoes. And it was a tough life, but that's what these were mainly. And of course, it didn't stop the Indians. They kept coming down anyway. And it looked like they'd never be able to dislodge the French out of Canada. Next, please. You can see, why is this stuff all basically British and not made locally there? Because tons of textiles were coming in, according to Elijah's account books. Huge amounts of woven textiles of all sorts from England, which was a world center of textile making. So it was a famous three-way trade that followed out of the British Navigation Act, that the home country was going to supply manufactured goods in return from raw goods coming from the colonies, and with the slaves dragged into this three-way trade from Africa into all the way up to Deerfield. So raw goods go this way. They could work rum. Rum was sent down here and over to here. And it was a fantastic amount of stuff, but it meant there were no manufacturers here. That's why on the frontier, a lot of those people, they relied on English consumer goods, almost 100%. Next, please. Here's one of Elijah Williams, just a page from his account book in 1753. Selling to people, some of whom are actually soldiers in the line of force. They're all in there, everybody, officers and soldiers alike. And it's an incredible, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of transactions in his account books. And I thought at one time of getting everything on when the computers are coming along, we'll really do something with it. And It was just too much. I couldn't. I had too many other things to do. But there they are down in Deerfield in the PVMA. Somebody should get at those because it's a perfect picture of mid-18th century northeastern America. Next, please. So what was this part of? It was part of what has been called the Consumer Revolution, which goes hand in glove with the Industrial Revolution, which is just taking off in Great Britain at that time. So here's London, mid-18th century, same time, and this stuff is coming from suppliers in London, like Robert Tippett in Bristol, England, with the pipes, coming down across the Atlantic to Boston, remember Boston is an incredibly successful trading port, and coming in, and there were all well-known middlemen there who were handling these goods because they were in close contact with the river gods of Western Massachusetts. Next, please. So this picture, let's say, by John Davis, a wonderful portrait painter of mid-18th century England, exactly contemporary. You can see this picture with the forts. I mean, this is the way everybody was in the colonies. This is what they wanted to be. These were the role models for the Williams family, and trickled down even to the poorer people who were working for them, to the militia. And you can see there's even a young slave here attached. This is a model that New England copied religiously. So it's the age of consumerism that is hitting up here. Next, please. The bigger picture is that how were the English ever going to solve the problem of the French up here and the Indians? And here's where the fortress of Louisbourg was. Cape Breton Island, wonderful place to visit, by the way. And as you know, in 1745, they captured, the New England farmers captured this place. And at 1748, however, was a temporary peace of Aix-la-Chapelle between the British and the French. And they had to give it back and trade for this colony in India. And they were not happy at all. So it was rebuilt and fortified even more, and controlled the mouth of the St. Lawrence here, Louisbourg. Huge, huge fortress. The British moved up here in towards Lake Champlain, where the French were located, dug in, and a series of forts here, such as Fort William Henry on Lake George. If you have ever seen that film called The Last of the Mohicans, with it's a really good picture of the taking of Fort William Henry and what happened. It's the best Hollywood treatment of the mid-18th century French and Indian Wars that I know. It's really incredibly accurate. But there were a series of forts, some of which went back and forth between the French and the English. Finally, Shirley decided something has got to be done finally. And he and Benjamin Franklin put together a conference in Albany to get all the colonies together as one. And everybody sent delegations in all 13 colonies, but they could never get them together. History would have been totally different if they had done so at that point. They would have remained British even until today. But so what did they finally do? Next, please. Well, here's the fortress of Louisbourg looking south. That's it in the distance. I took this from the sort of northern shores of that body of water can see this amazing thing. It was totally demolished finally. It was attacked by now British regulars and the British Navy. And the British had the best army in the world then, and they had the best navy. No question about what was going to happen. They attacked Louisburg finally at the end of in 1754 and demolished the whole thing. And what you see today has been rebuilt as a sort of archaeological tourist project. Next, please. I mean, it's you think of those New England farmers who took this damn place in 1745, you know, just militiamen took the whole thing. It was an incredible victory. But then it became a thorn in the side of the British later. Next, please. So this is what happened. The British finally, they got rid of all the French they could round up in this area here and sent them down to Louisiana. Totally, I mean, these are the Cajuns, actually, who all came from Acacia here. And they decided to do something with their regular forces, not with the militia. Next, please. So they moved in, and in 1755, they move up in the area of Lake George to push north towards Montreal and Quebec and get stopped. And leading, one of the leading guys in this was our friend Ephraim Williams, Jr. And he led his men up here in combination with the Mohawks. The Mohawks were on the side of the English, always, all the way along, even during the Revolution. And so they march up into a huge trap that was set by the British officers, and I mean by the French officers. And Ephraim Williams Jr. gets killed on the spot, and so does Chief Hendricks of the Mohawk. Terrible loss, but they managed to capture the French commander and bring him. So they weren't going to really lose it. This is Ephraim Williams Jr. now. And here's his last will. So what's in his last will? He leaves all of his money, most of it, because he had no descendants, no wife, to found a college, Williams College. So he's the founder of Williams. And still there's an Ephraim Williams Day. He's recognized as the guy who did it. Next, please. So by this time, George III now, who was a much better king than we make him out to be, George III was at the top, and William Pitt, the younger William Pitt, was prime minister, one of the best they ever had, and one of the best regular army generals was General Wolfe. And they make their all-out attack, destroy Louisburg, and go up the river and take Quebec. And that was the beginning of the end for French America. Next, please. This is the siege of Louisburg. They just demolished the whole thing to the ground. There was nothing left. Next, please. So what finally at the end happens? At 1763, the Treaty of Paris, France gives up all of its new world territories. This entire thing goes to Great Britain. This marks the end of this huge, of the 7 Years' War, of this world war that went on for a while. And what it means is that we're speaking English here now, and not French. We're under basically English law, the common law, and not under, let's say, the Napoleonic Code. It had profound reasons for this. I mean, the French had won that war, and they had, at one point, after the final assault on Louisburg, they had a huge fleet. It was like the Armada that was going to attack Boston and take New England completely. And they would have done it too, except that the Armada, the weather got them. They did this during what was basically the hurricane season, and they were demolished at sea by the forces of nature. So it never happened. So this became completely English territory. And you know, it's funny, this war is a forgotten war. I mean, I don't ever remember hearing about it in high school. You know, you sort of jump from Plymouth to the Revolution. This was all fought here on this spot. And let's say, in this case, we won. I mean, it was an extremely successful war. It was the greatest victory that Great Britain had ever had in its long history. And so we've got to remember the people who did this for us. That's it. Thank you.